Andrew Rosindell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased that I am following my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green. I only wish that when he was the leader of the Conservative Party, he then got on to become Prime Minister, because we wouldn't be sitting here today debating this issue. His last words of his speech just given said everything that needed to be said. All governments of all political parties have failed to do the right and moral thing over many decades. The Chagos Islands were depopulated, cruelly depopulated, and the people of the Chagos Islands were never given any say or any right of self-determination. Had that happened, decolonisation would have taken place, and there would never have been an international court ruling. The Chagos would have stayed British, and they would have proudly, as the Falkland Islands and the Gibraltarians have done, they would have voted in any referendum to exercise their right of self-determination and stay British. But all governments of all parties ignored the whole issue for decades, despite all the appeals of a small number of us that tried again and again and again, but were ignored. And so that is why we are in the position we are today. But I cannot disagree with almost anything of my former colleagues have been saying today about this issue. They've analysed it correctly. I only wish in the 14 years we had done something about it at that stage. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I won't at this stage. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, as all members, I think, on all sides of the House will know, there have been few issues that have consumed so much of my parliamentary life in 25 years as the British Indian Ocean Territory, Chagos Islands, and, more importantly, the Chagossian people. For more than 2 decades, I have fought for the Chagossian right of self-determination, as with all overseas territories and former colonies. I chaired the British Indian Ocean Territory all-party parliamentary group. In fact, I was the deputy chairman to the right honourable member for Islington North. So it's a bit of a juggling act in trying to get cross-party consensus about where we're heading on that. But the one thing that united that all-party group was the belief that the Chagossians should have the right of resettlement. And I argued strongly that ultimately self-determination, whatever the options are, the Chagossians make the final say, whatever happens. The Honourable Member for Islington North had a different view, but 7 political parties represented in that group came to the view that the first thing is resettlement, but the Conservative government over 14 years absolutely refused to even consider any option for resettlement of those islands. So I dealt with this issue also as a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee over 15 years. And unlike many who now speak with great certainty, they remained silent during that period, but I did not. And I've also been there. I've been to the British Indian Ocean Territory. I've walked those islands. I've seen the abandoned churches and schools. I've walked around the ancestral graves of the Chagossian people, the derelict homes, and the visible traces of a community expelled from its homeland and denied the right to return. And I've asked every minister, every government over and over again. I've been ignored, and a small number of us were ignored as well. I pay tribute to the former members Daniel Kaczynski, Shrewsbury, he raised it, and Henry Smith in Crawley. We all raised it, but over 14 years, sadly, the last government just dismissed it and refused to even consider it. I went to Peros Banos. They're the outer islands. They're 160 miles away from Diego Garcia. There's no security threat there. It took me get on 4 different boats to get to these outer islands. And people could live there with no issues whatsoever. Long, long way from Diego Garcia. And the Americans, despite the line from the Foreign Office, I went to the State Department, I raised it directly, and they said, we have no objections to the Chagossians living in the outer islands. It's our Foreign Office puppeteering this policy for years, and our ministers just went along with it, did nothing, ignored the facts. I went to Mauritius in 2002, accompanied by my right honourable friend, former leader of the Conservative Party, Michael Howard, Lord Howard of Folkestone. And it wasn't part of the official programme, wasn't part of it, but I said, please, can we go and visit the Chagossians in Port Louis? And after a bit of a flurry from officials, in the end we insisted and we went to meet leaders of the Chagossian community. And that was 2002. It was pretty much my first year as a Member of Parliament. And so when I speak about Chagos, I do so from long experience, having visited Chagossian, the outer islands, as I've mentioned, and I conclude that this represents, by all parties sadly, a shameful betrayal of the loyal British Chagossian people. And the bill the government is putting forward is nothing short of a surrender. It hands away British sovereignty over a territory we have administered for more than 2 centuries. It binds generations of British taxpayers to a grotesque financial settlement, tens of billions of pounds paid to a foreign government simply so that we may have lease back on the military base that we already own. That is vital to our security, and that is one of our closest allies, and yet we are prepared to risk that vital military and security base for the next century because of this shabby deal. And so ministers justify this capitulation by sheltering behind so-called international law. They insist that a non-binding advisory opinion of a court whose jurisdiction is explicitly excluded from intra-Commonwealth disputes is somehow beyond negotiation. Yet at the same time, they are content to ignore the 1966 agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom, an actual binding international treaty, which states plainly it is in its very first clause that the territory shall remain under United Kingdom sovereignty. That consideration tells us everything we need to know, Madam Deputy Speaker. This was never really about international law. An act of total weakness, that is how it has been described by the President of the United States of America. And doesn't that just say everything about this government's approach? And it does all this without the consent or a genuine consultation or even the courtesy, which every other territory has been afforded, of a democratic vote for the Chagossian people themselves. Disgraceful as this bill is, it did not emerge, however, from a vacuum. For over 2 decades and 14 years, as I've mentioned, from the government backbenches, I urged the Foreign Secretary after Foreign Secretary, Minister after Minister, speaking in the lobbies, going to the Foreign Office, talking to officials, discussing it over and over again, calling them into all-party group meetings, raising it at the FAC, Foreign Affairs Committee, to talk about the Chagossians and their right of resettlement and self-determination. Ignored all the way through. I certainly give way to my right honourable friend.
Sir Julian Norris.
I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend, as I will always regard him, having known him for the past 40 years and having known that his patriotism is beyond question, for giving way. And does he agree with me that there's a bit of a pattern here? Because the government clearly wants to do this surrender deal giveaway, and yet tries to shelter behind inconclusive, legalistic analysis. And isn't this exactly the same as the betrayal of our Northern Ireland veterans,
yes,
where the government, when pressed, admits
yes,
that it wanted to remove the immunity for our veterans anyway, but it still seeks to shelter behind questionable legal considerations that have not been fully tested. Why won't the government, when it wants to do these terrible things, at least have the guts to stand up and admit that that's what they want to do, and that's not what they're being forced to do by lawyers whose credentials and jurisdiction are in question, to put it at its mildest?
Yeah. I agree with every word my very dear and long-standing friend has said. I say to you, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I sit here on a different bench now, but I look over the chamber there and I see colleagues over there who I still agree with on most things, but I see people on that side of the chamber who, some of whom, and certainly some of whom in government today, seem to hate everything about this country and want to undermine this country. And this is the Northern Ireland veterans and this particular issue over the surrender of one of His Majesty's territories against the wishes of the people is exactly what I'm talking about. And I will certainly give way to my friend.
I thank him for giving way. Both he and I have visited the Falkland Islands, although on different occasions. Would he agree that there is a strategic runway and base there at RAF Mount Pleasant? Would he agree with me that what the government are doing is analogous to paying Argentina £35 billion to rent back that base in the Falkland Islands, which also belong to us and wish to be British?
Well, my Vice Member friend is completely right, and there is a precedent here. The Falkland Islands could have gone the same way. Gibraltar could have gone the same way, and if we indeed they tried to do so. In 2002, one of the biggest campaigns I've ever fought was against the joint sovereignty plan by Tony Blair, again against the wishes of the Gibraltarian people. And I commend the Speaker of the House of Commons, who I worked with very closely at that time, working to keep Gibraltar British, as we did in 1982 to keep the Falkland Islands British, but it's always on the basis of self-determination. I will make some progress if I may. And so, with assurances of the United States and with precedents around the world where indigenous people live alongside military installations, I tabled an urgent question in 2016, calling for exactly that. The response from the then Conservative Foreign Office Minister, Sir Alan Duncan, was this. And he said, and I quote, "We do not consider that the right of self-determination actually applies to the Chagossians." That is what he said at the time. Madam Deputy Speaker, what a colossal disgrace. Sir Alan compared Chagossian resettlement to Pitcairn. Another British community the Conservative government at that time was willing to discard to another nation, even though Pitcairn later proved strategically vital for our accession to the CPTPP. And I'm sad to say that the government is correct, that it was the government at the time, my government, Conservative government at the time, that began this scandal, conducting 11 rounds of negotiations with Port Louis. And I commend Lord Cameron, who ended those talks, and rightly so, but they should never have begun in the first place. But I do say, why did my former party not repudiate that whole policy entirely afterwards? Why didn't they say, that's the end of it, never again, and repudiate the failure to give self-determination from Sir Alan Duncan before? Why didn't we jettison that entire policy? We didn't do so. Even from within the Shadow Foreign Affairs team, I argued very strongly that the policy was fundamentally and morally wrong, and that self-determination must be central to our response, but I was, Madam Deputy Speaker, shut down. Opposition to this bill, I'm afraid, does not come from principle of convenience. The cost of this surrender is indeed eye-watering, and has been the focus of the opposition for the last year, but no amount of money compares to the dishonour of selling out of British people. Self-determination is fundamental to everything I believe in. So fundamental, in fact, that it rendered my position as a shadow minister untenable. But I am pleased to hear the words of self-determination now being used from the Shadow Foreign Secretary earlier, because when I've asked for this in the past, I've been told that's not the party policy. So I am thrilled if now, at long last, self-determination for the Chagossian people is official party policy. I hope that is the case, because then everything I've been fighting for the last 25 years has been worth it. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill and its origins under both this Labour government and the previous Conservative government represents the moment that I had enough over this issue and needed to say clearly that country has to come before party. And I believe the Chagossians deserve the same democratic rights as every other British citizen. And that is why I was genuinely horrified and upset a few weeks ago to be prevented, on Conservative Whip's instruction at the time, from voting for the amendment tabled in this House by the Honourable Member for Surrey Heath, who is a fine addition to this House and has campaigned wonderfully for the rights of the Chagossian people. And his amendment sought to guarantee a referendum for the Chagossian people. And I went to the door and I was told I cannot go in and vote for it. And I apologise to my Chagossian friends that I let them down on that, but I was told not to. And I felt deeply upset that I didn't do so. And I made it clear to the Honourable Member for Surrey Heath that he had my support and still has my support in what he was proposing. Meanwhile, genuine opposition on the benches from which I speak today has put aside party squabbles, because national interest must always come before party, and they backed the Liberal Democrat amendment. There's not really much in common usually between Reform and Liberal Democrats, but on this it's a matter of principle. So my colleagues in my new party voted for the Honourable Member for Surrey Heath's amendment, and I commend them for that. It asks simply to give a displaced people the right of consent before their homeland is gift-wrapped and donated to a foreign country. That's all we're asking. Let the people decide. Who can seriously disagree with that principle? And so we rightly insist on self-determination for the Falkland Islanders. We strongly uphold it for Gibraltar, and we defend it for every other British overseas territory and former colony, and the government is happy to support this principle over Greenland, it seems, but not for their own British Chagossian people. It makes no sense, and it's morally reprehensible. And what took place in the House of Lords at third reading was, I believe, shameful. Peers repeatedly called for a division. Shouts of not content were heard again and again. Yet the House was denied the opportunity to vote. A bill of immense constitutional, financial and strategic consequence. One of the most important pieces of legislation of this Parliament was nodded through on a procedural manoeuvre, squandering a chance to kill it. And I was further disturbed to learn from many Conservative peers who contacted me very angry that they had been instructed not to vote the bill down, not because the arguments were weak, not because the numbers were lacking, but because of a quiet understanding that sovereignty should not be defended too robustly today, lest it cause inconvenience for tomorrow. Many, many members of the House of Lords contacted me absolutely in despair at the instructions they were given by the whips in the Lords. So this is not coming from me, because I'm not in the Lords, but those who are there were deeply upset by that. And that, Madam Deputy Speaker, crossed the line for me. A Conservative government denied the principle of self-determination. And this Labour government has gone further, much further, surrendering the homeland entirely without any consent of the Chagossian people. This, I'm afraid to say, is a bipartisan failure. This legislation sells out the King's Islands, binds future generations to vast financial liabilities, and ignores the rights of an exiled people. I could not in good conscience remain silent or complicit, disarmed of any meaningful say in the deliberations of my former party, and in fact ashamed that the party of Margaret Thatcher, the party that took back the Falkland Islands in defence of the principle of self-determination, would be implicated in this betrayal. Perhaps the Prime Minister will keep to the word of his own Deputy Prime Minister, who stated on ITV in February that if President Trump doesn't like the deal will not go forward.
I'm sure the honourable gentleman is aware of pressures of time, and I'm sure that he'll be bringing his remarks to a conclusion shortly. Andrew Rosindell.
Just announce the
so given the... Given the President believes this deal to be a, quote, act of great stupidity, perhaps the Prime Minister should show some courage, withdraw this legislation and scrap this atrocious deal altogether. Madam Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, it should be cast into the dustbin of history where it belongs, mark an end to this government's policy of managed decline and prove that when it comes to the sovereignty of people over their homeland, whether it be Chagos, the British Indian Ocean Territory, or any other territory that is being decolonised around the world, it is the people themselves who must decide, have the final say and be given the right of self-determination.
Yeah.